Welcome to KSOK Uncensored. Tonight's guest is John O'Connor, legal analyst and author. John's most recent books, two that are really hot right now, The Mysteries of Watergate, What Really Happened, that was authored in 2022. But this one is really making waves. Postgate, How the Washington Post Betrayed Deep Throat. For those who don't know who that is a pseudonym given to the person who went undercover for the Washington Post and brought these truths forward. But there's so much more to that. Do you think that a media outlet actually put out the full truth? Probably not. And we have John here to dive into that with us and bring it full circle because we're seeing that nonstop today, this partisan journalism. Welcome, John. Thank you for being on KSOK Uncensored.
Kristen, great to be with you.
Oh, you as well. There is so much. I have to be honest. I had to prep quite a bit for this interview because, I'm born in 81. I had heard about Watergate. I had heard about the informant. There's that word I was looking for earlier. And I had to really dive in to be able to sound like I know what I'm talking about a little bit. But I am glad you're on here because this subject matter, though occurred in the 70s, it is so relevant today because of the partisan journalism that we are seeing now more than ever. And some would argue that what happened with Watergate is really the first of the partisan journalism at that level where they're driving home a narrative. Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. This is the first place in any major way that the media joined with one side of the partisan divide to shape a very important narrative, one that got rid of a country's overwhelmingly reelected president. So it was not only significant in what happened, the effect of it, but it also wrote the playbook for today. It was the marriage of a biased media with one side of the political aisle for partisan effect that helps both of them. And that's what's
Yes,
happening today on steroids.
absolutely. So we have Richard Nixon, Republican, and he was going for his second term and won overwhelmingly. Despite this was behind the scenes at that point, right? But
Right.
despite Watergate, won. And so we have then we have the exposure from the Washington Post. And again, for those that don't know, the Washington Post was deeply rooted with the DNC, had major ties with the DNC. So if you wonder why would they expose something and leave out details, well, it's because they had an objective. They did not want Nixon back in office. And I'm sure there's quite a bit more that you can share with the folks watching.
Well, yes. What happened in Watergate was 5 burglars were arrested on June 17, 1972, burglarizing the DNC, or the Democratic National Committee. At first blush, one would think this had some political tie to the upcoming election. It did not, although it sort of appeared that way to the public, which still thought this was kind of a roguish one off proposition. But what the Post knew, and the Post eventually blew this up so that it was just this massive conspiracy to fix an election that came to the Oval Office. Well, it was none of that. Right away, Kristen, the Post knew that, first of all, that this had nothing to do with the election. This had to do with overhearing naughty boys and naughty girls talking from the DNC to the place down the street where the girls operated out of. That's number one. And so the Post naturally wanted to protect the DNC from that sort of unseemly revelation.
Mm.
The second aspect of this, right away, the Post knew that the CIA was heavily involved in this and was probably behind it. It had infiltrated the White House. Now, it knew that, but remember, if it outs the CIA, then the question is, what does the CIA have to do with an election? And the answer is nothing at all. They want to listen to the naughty boys and naughty girls. This is part of their
Mm.
program of domestic espionage. So they had to protect the CIA. And of course, by protecting the CIA and protecting the DNC, you also got the hated Richard Nixon. So it was natural for the Post to go after Nixon, and they succeeded. And they had to actively hide, though, the real purpose of the burglary, and they had to hide the CIA's um, deep participation in it. And it worked. That's the terrible thing about it. It worked. And even today, on the 50-year anniversary we just passed, Bob Woodward of the Post, one of the key reporters, was still saying, "Oh, it was about Nixon obsessed with winning the election. That's why this burglary happened." No one in the upper reaches of the White House had any idea about the burglary or any program regarding it. It had nothing to do with the election. They were very puzzled about what happened. The Post knew, and here they're charged with cover up. The Post knew far much more than anybody in the Oval Office did, and the Post covered it up, and they are covering it up today. That is why they do not want anyone to read the book Postgate. It's about the cover up of Watergate primarily. And now what's happened is, as a result of that, which got the Post fame and prestige, Pulitzer Prizes, got everybody wealthy, and young journalists now went to school to change the world, like the Post did, all on the left-hand side. So it was a marriage of the partisan left and the media. And now news was no longer about telling both sides. It was telling news for an effect, which always skewed left. So it was a big deal. And that process is still going on. You do not see people out there trying to act like they're in the media, trying to act like they're impartial. And
Right.
so it's infected the whole major media.
It has, and I watched one of your interviews, and you basically said if this was happening in any other industry, it would be fraud. But the media is completely it's not managed. It's not managed where what you can tell one side of the story very openly, and there's no one there to hold them accountable. And this is just the MO now. You're completely fine. You have
Well, that's right.
CNN, you
That's
have
right.
right, and so it's very obvious, we tune into in guilty as a conservative, I'm gonna go watch Newsmax, or I'm gonna watch something that really, is a little more digestible for me. But we see the media on both sides really driving a narrative home, and it's not right. And I like that you said in another interview basically that no one wins awards for telling both sides of the story. It doesn't have that shock and awe. So they realized through this Watergate reporting from the Washington Post that wow, look at the notoriety and the awards that they won by disrupting at this massive level, and then it continued on, and we have spiraled out of control today.
Well, also, Kristen, not only did it affect the people that were already elected into office and got rid of Nixon and his people, but it seriously affected the further presidential election where Jerry Ford ran. And also, there was a wave of new congressmen and senators that came into office as a result of Watergate. In other words, it had the effect of obliterating the right side of the spectrum. It was like a nuclear bomb and made the Democrats look like the good guys. Oh, we're the clean guys. We're the people that care about uh, everybody, real people, and not these evil conservatives. So what we had a switch where Nixon had won 49 states out of 50 in the election, and now within a short time, because of the Post journalism, now all these people, all the conservatives are pariahs. You couldn't get elected if you're a conservative after that. You couldn't act conservative. You had to run away from being conservative. And it was a victory because before the 72 election, there was the country was riven much as it was today. Uh, but generally speaking, 60% of the electorate was on the more conservative side, and the other folks were, the young Vietnamese protesters and the civil rights people and the people who wanted to upend society and the socialists. Now all of a sudden they look real good. They were defeated handily in the election, but now because of the Post, you can say, they were really right all along. These nice people, and the other side really were nasty conservatives. So it had a partisan effect that went beyond just the Nixon administration.
That it's amazing to hear you talk about because I wasn't aware that he won 49 out of 50, and I know Reagan did. So it's wild that, everyone knows how amazing Reagan performed and how he was able to win by a landslide. But because of this reporting, Nixon hasn't gotten the credit for being overwhelmingly elected. So that's a real mind-blowing fact to really think through. And that's a soul-crushing devastation. I can't even imagine what he felt with this Washington Post reporting. I want to ask you, outside of the back taxes that Nixon owed, do you feel that he did anything illegal? Outside of the taxes, because I believe that to be true.
Well, even the taxes, he was arguably right. I think he wanted to deduct taxes for his presidential papers donation, which there were a couple of law firms that gave him that opinion. I talk about it in Postgate. But with Watergate being so overwhelming, he had to plead guilty to almost everything. Now, what he did do
Mm,
was, at the behest of John Dean, his young, somewhat unethical White House counsel, who Nixon really didn't know, it was a glorified title, but he got involved in the cover up of Watergate, and he had advised Richard Nixon to tell the FBI to lay off a Mexican money trail investigation to try to trace the source of the funds for the burglars, to lay off and to have the CIA tell the FBI that they had to lay off because they might interfere with the CIA investigation. Um, Now, it was a very white lie, so to speak, because Nixon was just trying to cover up for one of his political donors that was supposed to be a Democrat and contributed to him. But it was technically obstruction of justice, but is far less of a terrible act than, say, for instance, Bill Clinton committed or others have committed that we've seen Hillary Clinton commit. So, yes, technically he was guilty, but once that came out on a White House tape, there had been such furor up to that point about how terrible Nixon and the Republicans were that once that came out on tape, on a White House tape, that minor thing that I'm talking about, it had significance far beyond what it looks like today, which seems pretty mild. But that just blew it up. Once that happened, his advisor said, "Okay, you got to go. They got you. There's a proof here that you were covering up." Now, the assumption is if you covered up in that one instance, you must be covering up altogether and so forth. Whereas, in fact, Nixon didn't know what had happened. He wasn't covering up because he
right.
didn't know anything. And the White House
Wow.
tapes, actually, the other White House tapes verify that. These guys are sitting around the Oval Office trying to figure out who ordered this burglary. They all thought it might be somebody in their own administration. It wasn't, other than John Dean, who was involved in it, but a very lowly guy who was sneaking around down in his lower trenches. But yes, it was very minor. Let's put it this way. But it made the Post look like they were on it the whole time. It made John Dean look good, who had turned state's evidence. But in fact, once you put everything in context, Nixon is a victim. If you don't put it in context and you look at the way the Post reported it, I at the time was a federal prosecutor, and I thought he had to go. I was I was fooled by this, and I looked at it very, very closely at the time. I knew who Deep Throat was. I had looked at it so closely because I was trying to study that. So if it could fool me, it could fool just about everybody. And they did a good job of the fraud. Now, in my books, I talk about the fraud and how they did it and how they got away with it. In some cases, like a good movie, there are narrow escapes for the fraudster, but they did it. And the whole thing worked. Uh,
Wow.
so I
And
get
it
into the
speaks
idea that,
volumes. It speaks volumes that your background, you're like, I fell for it, and I'm this person who's diving into all the detail, and I fell for it, right? So that shows the level that we are working with even today with the CIA and the FBI. It is a psyops level that is been deployed about on us, and it's something where you were feeling it even during Watergate, right? You were able to feel that on the receiving end. And so That right there really stands out to me, that that's something that you admittedly, I mean, it kind of makes me think about when COVID first came out. I wore a mask for 2 weeks and then I woke up, right? So it's one of those things where they're good. They know what they're doing. They know how to trigger you and play into your fears and your anxieties, and back then obviously different MO, but still this a similar outcome. So I want to dive into, you mentioned deep throat. So for not everyone is familiar. And so that is the pseudonym given by the Washington Post. Is that correct?
Yes, there was a
Okay.
pornographic movie at the time called Deep Throat. And because Mark Felt, my client, was working under, quote, deep cover, he was a deep source. That is to say, he was not to be quoted in print. Um, the news people had the nickname for him of Deep Throat, which sort of stuck. And Woodward and Bernstein wrote about it in their best-selling book. And in the movie, Deep Throat was a major character played by Hal Holbrook, one of the great movies of all time. And the Deep Throat character really struck the public's imagination and made people
Mm.
hunger to find out who it was. So I spent my spare time in those days trying to figure it out. I didn't figure it out. By 1976, I'd figured it all out. Didn't think anybody would care what I thought, but I figured it out. But he was an amazing source. And the reason he did it was not to get Nixon. He was not anti-Nixon. He just didn't like the fact that the White House was artificially restricting the scope of his investigation just to the burglary, as opposed to protect perhaps associated crimes that could help him solve the burglary. He wanted to know who had really authorized it, the same thing that Nixon did. Who authorized this thing? And so my client felt that if he had pressure from the newspapers to have a full and fair investigation, he could figure out if the White House did order this. Now, later on, I think he figured they didn't, and later on, he realized the CIA had done it. It was the main moving force behind this, but the Post wouldn't print that. And he told the Post all about the CIA and how the CIA was threatening murder. And I wrote it right in my book about how,
Wow.
at least as the one person, it looks like they did murder to keep his mouth shut, and maybe another one. There's a second person who also died under Putin-like circumstances, let's put it that way, and both of them who could blow the whistle on the CIA. But the CIA escaped, and so did the Democrats.
Wow. Okay. So I'm trying to go back to Felt. Okay. So Felt, Mark Felt, right? So that is deep throat. So at the
Right.
time, so his position, he was working for the FBI, correct?
He was the head of the investigation. Yes.
Okay. Okay. And then he felt it sounds like, I watched his Larry King interview. I saw you on there as well. It seemed like his MO was pure. Like he wanted to really make sure that the truth was exposed. And I know in
Right.
your book, Postgate, how the Washington Post betrayed Deep Throat. I want to dive a little further into the betrayal and really how he potentially, I don't know this for sure. I want to hear what you have to say about it, but did he come to regret working with the Washington Post on this?
No, he didn't. He always felt he had done the right thing uh, because he kept our system pure, the justice system pure. And that's what I told him when I first met him. I said, Mark, I know you're deep throat. I know you haven't admitted it, but I believed as a young prosecutor that the you kept us free from taint. You kept the justice system pure, and accordingly, uh, you should come out and tell everybody. He was a little embarrassed about it because he thought other people wouldn't realize his motives, but they were pure. He wanted justice. And as he told me and his daughter years later, um, I I wasn't out to get Nixon. I was just doing my job. And that's
Right.
really the way he looked at this. And so he was always secretly proud of what he did, but he didn't think anybody would understand his motives.
You know, it was what I got that from him, from his interview with Larry King, and I didn't like how Larry kept referencing his age and dementia and all of that, but that's a whole other thought process there. But I felt like he was, I don't know, did you I'll actually go there. Did you feel that Larry
Yes,
King, did he do that to save face because he had the Washington Post journalists also on the show? Do you feel it was necessary
yes.
to Larry to continuously call out his age? and the fact that his
Well, yes.
memory might be failing.
No, Kristen, that's what the Post had him do that. The Post agreed to appear on
Oh,
the program. They tried to keep me off. They threatened that I couldn't come on, and that Woodward and Ben Bradley would not come on if I came on. And finally, I backed them down. I said, no, well, I'm coming on, so those guys can back
good
off
for
if they
you.
want. No, no. What they did was they constantly did that because the Post felt that would somehow absolve them. They looked real bad because they would not cooperate with me when I tried to tell the story. And of course, as I write in the book, it was really for Woodward's selfish purposes. He wanted to write a book and keep all the money. And I think the Post itself was afraid of somebody like me saying something that would tarnish, as it should, tarnish their reputation. So you had all these
Right.
motives for them to, and then when Bradley and Woodward talk, they say, "Oh, it's so bad to see Mark like this." Well, really, he didn't come off badly. He's an old guy, but he didn't come
Yeah.
off like this crazy, demented guy. But they kept mentioning that. The daughter was very upset at that. I didn't want to get into a brouhaha on TV on this, as I told you, so I sort of kept diplomatic here. But yes, that's what they
Right.
were trying to do. They were trying to throw shade on Mark. And that's ironic because he was the guy that was most responsible for them becoming something more than a second tier rag, which they were, getting them a Pulitzer Prize. All of this came because of Mark Felt.
Right.
Um,
Wow.
and uh, and then they turn on him. And interesting, this is just a sidelight. 6 years later, they cheerled for his indictment, and he got
Oh,
indicted because he was doing his job as we would like to do today, and he was searching for the Weather Underground, who were bombing buildings, in the PLO, which had just killed people in the Munich Olympics. And somehow the Post thought those were terrible acts, and they cheerled his indictment and so forth. But so they really turned on him because he was, quote, conservative, unquote, and nobody knew he was deep throat. So the Post has a lot to answer for the way they treated Mark Felt, but
yeah.
and that's one of the ways they betrayed him. In addition to not publishing what he knew about the CIA, he gives them
Mm.
when he gives them a lead that looks like it hurts Nixon, they blast it all over their newspaper and keep up with it. But when he realizes that the narrative is something else, that it really is the CIA, now all of a sudden everything he says about the CIA goes unprinted.
Oh, I'm sure
So
it did.
uh,
I'm sure it did.
yes, so
I want to reinforce what you said because when I watched him on Larry King, and again, this is in 2006, I did not see anything outside of someone. I have a grandma with dementia. I can tell you if someone has dementia. I saw an older man. He was in his 90s, for goodness sake. So the fact that he was being continuously discredited by Larry King and by the two Washington Post, I don't have their names memorized, but those two guys continued to discredit him. I knew exactly what they were doing. It was cringy to watch it, and so I saw an older man being interviewed, and I personally, as someone who doesn't know the family, I felt disrespected, right? Just for him, I felt that disgrace that they put upon him by just, oh, he's old, he's saying this, but he's old, he doesn't remember the details, he's got dementia. I mean, how many times can you say the same thing? So that was very clear, and that goes back to this partisan media. And journalism that we see so often. But John, I don't want to forget to touch on something very important. You mentioned, so you did a lot of research into uncovering who Deep Throat was, but the way that you actually got to know him, and he just kind of fell into your lap in a sense through your daughter, or excuse me, his daughter. You were friends with
yeah.
his daughter. Can you tell us that story?
Well, yeah, I'm at the very table I'm sitting at now. I had her friends over from Stanford for a Sunday feast. All their dining hall cards had been maxed out. And so my wife and I had them up here for a little feast, and I did the beer and wine, and uh, Jan did the cooking. And then I was telling stories about my father, an undercover FBI agent during the war, and some funny stories. Some of these kids had just been to Brazil for a semester off. And when I was telling the story, this one young man who I knew very well said, "Hey, Big John, my grandfather was in the FBI the same time as yours, and he was also a counterintelligence guy. Maybe your dad knew him." And I said, "Well, Nick, what's your grandfather's name?" And he said, "Mark Felt. He went pretty high up in the bureau." And I said, "Nick, do you know your grandfather's deep throat? Uh, I'd like to, by the way, I'd like to come up and talk to him because I think I know what buttons to push, and I think I can have him talk him into coming out." And that's exactly what happened. The next Sunday, I went up to their house, but he had always lied to the family, denied he was deep throat, and so I had to talk him into it. But I knew the buttons to push, and I knew that he thought he was a hero, and I let him know that I thought he was a hero and had done the right thing. So I knew the buttons to push, and it took a few weeks, but he finally agreed to do something. And then, of course, I
Wow.
tried to talk to Bob Woodward, and Woodward was not buying what I was selling. And it was very clear to me that he was just putting the family off. And
Yeah, he was
so,
one of the 2 journalists, right? Woodward was one of the 2 Post journalists. Was it
right. And
Woodward
he
and
was the one who had
Bernstein?
the contact. What? Yeah, Bernstein. And he was the one,
Okay.
Woodward was the one that was the more famous because he had the relationship with Deep Throat, and Bernstein did
Okay.
not. Bernstein did not meet Mark until 2008, right before his death, and I recount the meeting in my book. But Woodward was the only one who really knew who he was for a long time. Finally, let Ben Bradley, the editor who was on that program, and Carl Bernstein know who he was. But that was that. But so Woodward was the guy with the contact. But then when we
Okay.
finally got to Woodward, who professed to be his great friend, of course, he didn't want
Yeah.
to have anything to do with someone who would want a split of the proceeds. Okay. So that's really what
Yeah,
it
can
boiled
imagine.
down to. Yeah.
Right. It's really like divine intervention that you had done all of this research in the '70s, and to have it come full circle in, what was it, 2005, or was that when he actually agreed to go public? When were you
Well,
actually introduced to him?
in 2002, and
Okay.
it took us 3 years first for me to convince the family that Woodward wasn't worth talking to, and secondly, to go find a publisher who would believe us. Because Mark could not prove his own identity. He did not have the
Mm.
deep memory of which garage he went to or anything like that. I knew more than Mark did about proving his identity. He knew he was deep throat, but he couldn't give you a reason why he was deep throat. I knew I could prove it through circumstantial evidence, and people would buy my program, but people don't trust circumstantial evidence. So they would listen to me. I went to Time Warner, Time Magazine, and they were with me for 6 months, and then at the end they get shaky, they get cold feet, and they leave me at the altar. I go to another book publisher, do the exact same thing. 6 months later, they leave me at the altar, all because they're afraid they're going to lose their jobs if this lawyer is lying to them. So a lot of it
Right.
was they don't have the confidence that I had in my own case, which I
Right.
felt I could prove beyond a reasonable doubt without Mark's participation. So,
Oh,
if it hadn't have been for this funny meeting of me and Mark, I don't think anybody else would have had the knowledge to talk him into coming out, or even to be able to prove it to anybody. I
I
finally
believe
got
you.
I finally got it to Vanity Fair to bite on this, and even they were not quite absolutely 100% certain, but they had a little more risk tolerance than the other folks did, and they just said, "Hey, let's go for it," and they did.
I love it. I love it. There's so much here. I cannot wait to read your book cover to cover. All right, where can people find your books and contact you if they'd like to get in touch?
Well, the best thing is to go to my site, postgatebook.com, and on it you can order from. It'll take you to Amazon or Barnes and Noble to order, but also people can reach me with questions. Every now and then I get a question, and I'm happy to answer it.
Excellent. Well, this has been incredible. I can't wait to pass this one around. So much history here, so much history. And this is the first time on my show we've even touched on Watergate. So thank you, John. There's so much more to your life I would have loved to dive into. You had some really interesting cases you worked on early on in your career. Would have loved to have gone there. Maybe we'll do a 2.0. But I really appreciate you taking the time to come on. And I know that everyone watching is just going to be thrilled with what you have to say and are going to go buy your book to really get all of the juicy details. I appreciate you so much. Thank you for being out there, spreading the truth. I've heard many interviews that you've done, and this is not the only topic you've spoke out on. So I just appreciate you being a truth teller, and in this day and age, especially. You have a wonderful evening. And for everyone watching, we will see you next Thursday.